Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus. You can support the show for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. The spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share this episode with a friend. It's July 23rd, 2024, and the Cubs are 49-53, coming out flat in a pivotal homestand a week ahead of the trade deadline. While we all wait to see how the Cubs play out this last stretch and what they do at the deadline, I chat with draft guru Greg Zumach, a writer for Northside Bound and co-host of the Cubs on Deck podcast. We talk about last week's MLB draft, how those new draftees will plug into a deep system, and how all of this plays into the upcoming deadline decisions. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 83. This week I'm thrilled to be joined by a friend of the pod, Greg Zumach. Greg, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. It's a good time to talk Cubs baseball, Cubs draft.
Yeah. Are you caught up on sleep now after all the work you have to do leading into it?
Yeah, I am. I mean, it's still very fun for me, and it's not my real job. So, balancing my real job and getting, of course, things I need to get done is a little bit different than something I kind of just do in the nights and weekends and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, it's a ton of fun and certainly caught up from a sleep perspective. I think it's now just seeing the rest of the class come together. And then I'm already working on 2025, and I've had a chance to kind of jump into some showcase events and just kind of get that sense. I know it still feels very early for some folks, but yeah. I can tell you that like MLB teams they have not stopped. There's maybe a little bit of a brief respite with some travel until East Coast Pro, but I mean, folks are already kind of gearing up for 2025.
Oh yeah, I mean, you got I think the College Wood Bat Leagues are kind of wrapping up about this point, but this is like high school travel season. This is prime. Well, let's start at the top. So the Cubs took Cam Smith overall, number one. What I saw from this draft, I was reading stuff from you and the rest of the crew at Northside Bound, Eric Longenhagen at Fangraphs. It seems like college bats were really kind of in vogue this year and were really kind of the focus on the upper part of the draft. Is that kind of what you saw?
Yeah, I think so. It's really hard to know necessarily what the Cubs were looking for, but I think... Well, maybe it's not. I think it's hard to know everything that went on behind the scenes, right? Like, I think that's probably the deciding line there. But as far as tackling certain types of tendencies, the Cubs heavily focused on a few of them. And one of them, was showed out with Cam Smith right away, and we will likely talk about it with a few of the other guys, which is that there are some questions with regard to how the ball is playing in college baseball right now. And there really aren't those same type of questions in the Cape Cod League, the Summer Wood Bat League, that is one of the best areas for talent in college baseball.
And that's largely a bat concern, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no concerns there because it's all wood bats. And so... you can take that kind of data that you get and then you can transfer it, especially on the hitting side, much better. And so every team has models. They've got like data modeling and stuff. Like it's not a Moneyball thing where, one team's trying it or only the super data driven teams are using models. They're all using models. Like every team is using models. But so clearly the Cubs believe, I mean, I'm not saying anything from like any sort of inside perspective that I've been given, but I mean, if you just look at the draft, there was heavy focus on the Cape Cod League and the hitters, that how they performed in that league. So you take that and then you immediately look at it through that lens with Cam Smith. Well, he was really exceptional in the Cape Cod League. He was an outstanding performer in the Cape Cod League. He had dramatically changed his swing from his freshman year to his sophomore year, which is draft eligible. So even leading up into the Cape Cod League in between his freshman and sophomore year, his swing was a little bit different. When he started college, he had a swing a little bit more geared to launch. There was a lot of whiffs. There was a lot of chase. For a freshman, still an above-average performer, but yeah, there were some questions with regard to what is this guy going to look like long-term. Is he a first-rounder? If you were to look at things at the end of this freshman year, I would say that there would be less people that would think he was a first-rounder the following year. But he goes into the Cape Cod League, did extremely well on the Cape, showed power, showed decreased whiffs, showed decreased chase, and people were like, this guy's a first-rounder. That's how I felt entering the year. He ultimately ended up sliding in right about the middle of the first, which was nice value. And this is a guy that in his sophomore year was quite successful. He played in the ACC and did extremely well. I saw him live in Omaha. At times, I had him graded out as an above-average third baseman from the games that I watched kind of earlier in the year.
Okay.
I didn't find that at the end of the year, but I'm not saying he was like playing through anything or whatever, but I think we just have to remember like the grind at the end of the season when everything is on the line, right? Like you go through the ACC gauntlet, then you go into regionals, then super regionals, and then finally you're playing for a championship in Omaha. Like even if you're gassed, you're just going to keep pushing. Yes, so I think that he's still kind of a third baseman long term and above average one potentially, and overall one that Cubs VP of Scouting Dan Kantrovitz has talked about. They don't feel like he's plateaued. They feel like there are still some improvements to be made, but already that he looks really good.
Yeah, it seems like he's a guy that, one of the things I see with the Cubs a lot, you see it in the Major League roster, and I think we saw it the last couple drafts. They go for a lot of high ceiling guys. I mean, not high ceiling, high floor guys.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know about high ceiling.
No,
I think they've got some ceiling, but it definitely high floor guys.
That's actually one of my frustrations with Jed. I'd like to see a little more take a shot, a little more roll the dice. But how do you see Cam moving through the system? I know like last year, Matt Shaw just took off once he hit pro and didn't hit any snags till the first part of this season.
Yeah, a lot will be determined when Cam kind of gets into affiliated ball. I really hope he does play in affiliated ball here fairly soon. It sounds like he's already down in Arizona. Mm-hmm. I think it's already a pretty good sign there, and he's had a little bit of time off in between like Omaha and now, and so hopefully he feels rested and ready to go. I don't know that he'd be on the Matt Shaw trajectory. I've been asked this a few times, and it's natural to kind of lump them two together. Like Matt Shaw is a Cape performer, drafted in a similar place, like also kind of being touted as potentially a third baseman in the future, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I like the comparison because I think it's a fairly good one. Matt Shaw seemed to force the issue. Like he was being assigned to South Bend, and I think if he finished the year last year in South Bend, everyone would have been very happy. Mm-hmm. But then he just kept cranking the ball, and it was to a point where I'm not running the Cubs and their minor league development, but I'm at least having the questions of are they like arbitrarily just holding this guy back?
Yeah, because
him going up to play Double-A seems unfathomable, right? And yet, just where he was, he just forced it. I truly believe he just forced them to promote him a little bit because he just wasn't getting the challenge. And I don't think I would put that on Cam, but I could see him being up and about South Bend this year. I think if he were to be in South Bend by the end of the year, even Myrtle Beach is fine, looking good, showing power. They don't really need to mess with his swing too much or anything. I think long-term there's some adjustments to be made. But, I just honestly, him getting his feet wet, I think would be great. And then if sometime next year he's playing in Double-A, I think that's excellent.
Yeah, I would agree. We don't have to go pick by pick through them all. It was 20 picks. The Cubs have signed 13 or 14 at this point?
Yeah, I think that's about right. There's pretty much everybody looks good, feels good. I don't know how official anything is yet. I don't think they've signed Eli Lovich, but I
Yeah,
believe
he was one I was going
he's
to ask about
down.
for sure.
Yeah, he's definitely one we'll talk about. But I would say the majority of their class is signed.
I know he was one the Cubs have specifically said they're pretty sure they can sign him, and I know they obviously
It certainly
saved some
sounded.
slot dollars.
Yeah, they sounded more confident, and that's a good sign because he's a pretty tough buy away. But I think that they did their homework. Yeah.
Yeah, and the last few years they've done a good job with, like last year was Zaire Hope, getting him away from UNC. I mean, just identifying which guys they think they can go after and actually get on board. Who else there's a few guys I'm going to ask you about specifically, but who else from this draft class popped off to you?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on the expectations here. We can talk about like Cole Mathis here in a second, and he's their second rounder. He was a guy that entering the year I felt like I was a big fan of him. He had some kind of dark horse kind of discussion about potentially being like a first round kind of a guy. Was going to need to like really, really mash to get there, but certainly within the realm of possibility. And I had folks reach out like right after that pick who cover different teams or they're connected to different teams, and they're like, that was a great pick. Like that was just, they're like, love Cole Mathis. And so I think that speaks a lot of volumes, because sometimes I'll get people that are like, what are they doing? Like, that's a really weird pick. I got that with Wiggins last year. And ultimately, it looks good, but it still was a big question, whereas Mathis, like, universally, people externally were just like, that's an awesome pick. So we'll see what happens, but I think that one certainly jumps off the table there. There's a couple of the high school infielders in the middle, both Ronnie Cruz and Ty Southerson, that seem exciting for different ways, for different like foundational purposes. Ronnie Cruz, I think they just, I mean, I don't want to like overplay this, but it just feels like they might have out-scouted teams. He was a guy.
He was the one that was way down the board, right?
Yeah, he was the classic example of the rankings don't matter there. Evaluators are like external evaluators, even the best ones out there. Kylie McDaniel does amazing work. He's not usually going to hear about a guy like that very often, because if like one team really feels like they have a diamond, they're not going to share that. Like that's like the most sacred information out there. Like teams will be more forthcoming about, or it'll be more obvious about who they're taking or looking at in the first round. If they have like a secret day 2 selection that they feel is really good, I mean, they're guarding that like Fort Knox. And I think that's something to think about. So them picking him is interesting because it was at a point of the draft, him and Ty Southerson, two high school kind of shortstops, that they could have pivoted in different directions. There were some like college arms on the board. There were some really interesting high school arms on the board. They decided to really invest in those guys. And I'm curious how it goes. Overall, I've certainly got the benefit of the doubt for this drafting team. Their track record is pretty solid.
Yeah. And
so even guys that like, I wouldn't have taken him. And then they look like, oh, Jackson Wiggins is pretty good.
Yes.
So I think that, those are two of the ones that probably do need to jump out. And there's definitely some other guys that really intrigue me, but those are certainly some folks to watch there.
Yeah, it was interesting to me reading about kind of the prep work the Cubs did. It looks like they pivoted to, like you mentioned, the Cape Cod League, but then also ran a lot of their own draft camps. And that seems like it was a change, or at least an increase in volume from what they've done in the past. And was that more about being able to set up the scenarios? Volume.
Yeah, and I mean, laying eyes on guys a little bit more, getting data that you feel like you can trust. I mean, I think that's a huge part of it. It's a numbers game, which a Northside numbers game, if you will. Yes. And it's something that very clearly that's the direction that like the Cubs scouting group or even like the executive front office wants to take, just to have a greater pool of numbers. And so it is really interesting to see that. They, like last year heard, pretty good number of the workout individuals. And this year there was just so many of them that I barely heard anything at all. And that's just the nature of them wanting to really get a whole lot more people. So it was very fun to kind of see that and Dan Kanchovitz talked about, I think, like half the draft approximately were all guys that came in for workouts. So that should tell you like how much they value that.
That's a lot of time.
It is a lot of time.
I mean,
it's
obviously
an
that's the
exceptional
job,
amount of time.
but...
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see. So, going back to like probably around the time you first started covering the drafts, or when Jed took over, the farm system was pretty bare. I mean, they had obviously had that big wave where they had all those high draft picks and led to a championship and all that. But I think for a while it was really just about one developed pitching, because they went about 10 years without, I think, developing a single major league arm. And then obviously get the system stocked. Now it's stocked, and it's kind of weird to see them. A couple drafts ago they went with 9 of the first 10 picks were pitchers. Yeah. And this year they potentially drafted third baseman with their first 3 picks, depending on where guys actually map and project. How do you see it now? Obviously in baseball, you don't draft for major league need because these guys are going to go in the minors, but system wide, do you think they were trying to address needs and gaps, or do you think it was more about, let me just find the best possible upside or the highest caliber player I can find at this pick?
Probably not the first few rounds. The fact that they were like third baseman or infielders might be more of just like kind of a weird occurrence.
Okay.
But organizationally, the rest of the draft, I do think that they did identify certain things that they wanted to prioritize. And it's almost kind of a misnomer about not drafting for need, because it's like the weird like scale where people are like, oh, the common fans, like, you draft for need, and then like really when you get more in tune to it, you don't draft for need. And then even surprisingly, like, you'll ask around and it's like, well, I mean, we kind of do, but like at the tail end of the draft, right. Like you look like overall, but you're right, like the first few rounds,
there's gaps in system depth.
Absolutely, yeah. So the gaps, perfect way to describe it, right? Like that's just an absolute perfect way to describe it. That the certain batted ball data, I guess is the best way to put it, with like a decreasing chase, good amount of contact, strong wood bat numbers. Those are gaps in the system that they could really benefit from some very dependable hitters. Hitters that don't tend to expand the zone a lot. Hitters that hit for some power with wood. Hitters that generate contact. And like, that is an area that they really could stand to improve within the system. There are some players higher up that I think are really good, but they still, if you want to knock them for a certain, outside of Moises Ballesteros, if you want to knock them for a certain characteristic, I would say that expanding the zone or in-zone contact and chase is still part of it. And so that's an area that I do feel like they needed.
Well, and that's, I think, like when Nico Horner came through the system, his game was all about contact. And I have to assume that as pitching progresses and you get more of the 100-mile-an-hour throwers, it's about getting bat on velo and who can handle a fastball.
Yeah.
So in this draft, one of the things that actually surprised me going through was that they didn't really go for, would they take 2 pitchers in the first 10 rounds?
2 pitchers in the first 10 rounds, 7 on day 3, I believe. It surprised me. The lack of pitching actually did surprise me. That was like, as we were watching this happen, I was like, that's a choice. That's a decision. I mean, again, I kind of do trust them.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. And they've been intentionally the other way the past several years. I mean, last year, Matt Shaw was the guy they took number 1, but then they went and got Jackson Wiggins with that next pick.
And Will Sanders. I mean, they draft pitching 2 out of the top 4 rounds and stuff. Yeah.
And it's just interesting to see because they've clearly prioritized the pitching. I also found it interesting too that while at the major league level, the Cubs have talked a lot about run prevention and getting guys good on defense, this didn't strike me as a particularly great defensive class.
No, I think that's fair. I think that's a very fair thing. I'll leave Southlesson and Cruz out of it because we don't really know how they're going to develop. Cruz in particular is so young. So if you want to take the look at the other guys, Yeah, I'm a little bit more bullish on Cam Smith from a defensive perspective, but he's not like Manny Machado over there or anything. I think he's just,
Sure.
could be pretty good. Mathis has a lot of defensive questions, and there are some folks that still feel like he could be decent at all four corners, so like left, right field, third base, first base, but he kind of has to show it. And I certainly think if you're going to have a knock on the guy, defensive positioning is a huge one. Ivan Breathauer, who's a massive human being out of UCSB and big time power.
He's exciting.
Yeah, he's very exciting. I really like that pick. That's a great pick, but mostly for the bat there. I think that evaluators seem to be quite divided on how they feel with regard to him ultimately, looking out there. And so, yeah, from a defensive perspective, wasn't an overly strong group. Perhaps one exception to that is Ariel Armas, who's the catcher that they drafted in the 5th round. That's a guy that when you ask around, I mean, people are adamant that that's an amazing catcher. Like, he was like the conference defensive player of the year as a catcher. Some of his teammates
really
said he should have been the defender of the year in the entire NCAA. I mean, I think that kind of stands out there and may help him carve out a future major league role for a really long time.
Yeah, and talk about need. I mean, that's a need in the system. The Cubs don't have a ton of projectable catching in the system. Let's stick on Breathauer for a minute. So, huge guy. Obviously, there were some, just because of his size and the raw power, Aaron Judge comps, but realistically, like, he strikes me as one of the more potential, like, boom bust guys in this draft. Like, it doesn't seem like he necessarily has a position. A lot of strikeout, a lot of swing and miss, but massive power. Is that kind of how you see him?
I would say that it's certainly a higher variance type of a player. I'm just pulling up his data kind of as we speak here, because I would say that he actually was a lot better from like a contact perspective than I think folks would necessarily imagine.
Oh, okay.
It was about college average, so about like 78% contact, which is surprising, like not bad. I mean,
that doesn't come up in the write-ups form.
Yeah, it doesn't, and that's kind of to be expected. But to give you some context, like Christian Moore who went 8th to the Angels for an underslot, but he was like a top 15 kind of caliber player. Ran a pretty similar swing and miss rate or whiff rate, and so that kind of gives you like a ballpark there that you can still play at that level. Now Ivan Breathauer is not a second baseman, and so I do think that's going to matter. Sure. If you're a right field, right only corner, that's going to be different. Additionally, his chase is a little bit it's slightly higher than average at like 95 or not 95%. That'd be a pretty big chase rate, 25% chase. And so, something to watch, but like that's about where Matt Shaw was sitting last year.
Okay.
Certainly a higher variance guy. He can really put a charge into it. There's a possibility that he's not able to hit his way out of like Myrtle Beach or South Bend, at which point then, yeah, you don't really get much value out of it. But if you're taking a swing, pun very much intended, in the 7th round, this is the type of guy that you want to be taking a chance on.
Yeah, I would agree. Now, as these guys start to move in the system and sign, obviously the Major League Baseball has scaled back the minor leagues. You're down to just the 4 affiliates in the complex league. Was it 165 players?
165,
limited in the minor?
Yeah, in an org, yep.
The deeper the system gets, that's got to put pressure on guys who were drafted last year and the year before to make sure you're moving up. Because I assume the Cubs are going to have decisions to make here, bringing in 20 new players.
I think there's huge decisions, and it's really rough. I don't agree with it. I think 165 is paltry.
Yes.
I think it has massive effects on college baseball and the players. And we're starting to see that some teams view, high school guys as basically saying like, you should just go to college. We don't need to pay you. You can develop. we can decide in a couple years if we want to take you. I'm not saying that it's that crass, but it tends, like it's the vibe that I'm certainly getting with across Major League Baseball. Not every team's going to feel that way. What's that?
You're not the only person I've heard that from.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that all people feel that way, and I'm certainly not saying that the Cubs feel that way or the individuals that are in charge of the Cubs decision-making process feel that way in the slightest. But across Major League Baseball, there's certainly a feeling of we're not getting as much value out of the minor leagues. And so, yes, we'll increase their pay and provide them better living, which seems like baseline standards of what any employer should do. And they don't really need to get patted on the back for that. But, like, okay, good, at least you did that.
Let's take our elite athletes and actually feed them.
Yeah, exactly, right. That would be great. Amazing, that kind of investment in a player, what that could do. And or just another human being. But if we're looking at it, taking away the short season ball was a massive change. Mm-hmm. We saw the effects that it had on players, that there are still some players that I think are worse off because of that change. And, I mean, a guy like Ronnie Cruz, I'm not saying he's going to be worse off, but he would be a guy that you just hope to get into Arizona this year, let him play in Arizona, and then you are hoping that he is a guy who makes it up to short season ball next year. So, like a few years ago, he would have been a guy that would have gone to Eugene. Mm-hmm. And if he can just keep his head above water in Eugene, great. Then you can look at affiliated ball. I mean, that's still affiliated, but the other, like, A ball levels. Right. And they took that away. Ed Howard's another example. So with regard to this, the Cubs heavily invested in college guys, and it might be because that they believe a little bit more of, like, you know, we can kind of trust that. But yeah, I think that it all kind of has an interplay.
Yeah. Well, the high school has always been more variance anyway, because except for the truly elite guys, you draft a kid at 17, 18. You know, he's young if he's making his major league debut at 23, and that's 5-6 years later. So I sort of get it on that front, and then obviously cutting the stuff down, and all this change happened at the same time. Like, everybody lost a minor league season during COVID, and high school kids lost their. Ed Howard didn't play his senior season, so not only did he get shortchanged with fewer opportunities in pro ball, but he didn't actually play his senior year in high school. Yeah, and it was really tough. I mean, the tangible downstream effects we could probably do an entire podcast episode on. It's really rough. Who from day 3 pops off the page? Let's talk about. Let's start with Eli Lovich. I know the Cubs like to go for a high school overslot in that first pick on day 3. Yeah, he seems really, really exciting, actually. The Cubs seem particularly high on Eli Lovich, which is good. I don't mean that in a, like, I don't know, the Cubs are outliers there, but they just certainly felt like he was a much higher kind of a value guy, and are going to pay him accordingly. I think that, that's the hope, is that they will take care of that. But he is a tall individual who looks like he could gain a lot of really good weight. He's a guy who seems, at least from what I've checked out and from I've reached out to people, that fairly well coordinated for such a big, tall guy. I was telling folks that it gave me a little bit of like Owen Casey kind of vibes, in the sense that he's just a really tall guy, going to fill out a little bit. The power's going to be there, but he was already showing some like really raw batted ball data in their workouts. And I think that is very exciting. So to me, he's giving me some kind of like Owen Casey vibes. That's a lot to put on somebody, but at least I'm not like comping him to a Hall of Fame or anything. There's very similar kind of checkpoints in his swing and his movement patterns that just remind me of it. And whether I'm right or not, I don't know. But he's definitely a very exciting guy. I think he's probably one of the people to watch in this class to determine how well the Cubs executed their strategy. I think he's probably the big guy to watch there. One of the big guys to watch. And who else would you have on that list?
So I did like a few of the arms that went in day 3 in particular. There's a guy, Ben Johnson, out of Georgia Southern, that if you look at his stats, don't jump off the page. He was a senior. He had like a 5.8 ERA. It's okay. Didn't start all the time. I really like Ben Johnson. I don't know exactly what the deal is, but he's a guy that when I had people pass along his data to me, I was taking a look at it and I was like, there's like 4 or 5, I think there's 4 pitches that had like Stuff Plus models readings of like over 108. And I think the fastball was like 97 or something. And like Stuff Plus models aren't perfect. I've been very vocal about that. I think we overuse Stuff Plus models, and maybe this is blasphemy and on the pod here, but I think we overuse Stuff Plus models in the sense that we can get overly granular with the information to the point that I think I said this on Cubs on Deck. There will be accounts, and I'm not here to knock those accounts, but there will be accounts that have like every day they will post based on their individual Stuff Plus models, the top 10 individual pitches in Major League Baseball from a Stuff Plus model. Some of them are not even swing or miss. Some of them are not even close to the strike zone. And like I think, again, I'm not here to knock those accounts. I think what they do is they serve a use of providing like an information to those that are inclined numerically to view the game, and I think that that's great. Where I think that Stuff Plus models have more of a tangible benefit to major league teams and evaluators is where you plug in just these massive swaths of data, like thousands and thousands of data points across amateur baseball. And then you just see for like weird outliers. Like Ben Johnson, you look at his production stats, and then you look for the Stuff Plus models. And Stuff Plus, again, not the end-all be-all. He may just not be able to translate that into actual production. But you look at it and you're like, there's something there. Like there's some disconnect there. And so I'm just fascinated to find out what it is. I don't know it, and I will try to dive into it a little bit more as the dust settles and when he signs and all that. But there's something there, and I really want to figure it out.
Well, and that's like I'm a big fan of like the expected stats and things like that. It gives you context on stuff, right? But like it's like flipping a coin. I could actually flip tails 100 times in a row. The odds are really low, but we don't have any bearing on the next thing. And like guys like Dansby Swanson might just be having a crappy year, might be playing through an injury. Like,
yeah,
he probably will trend back to his career numbers, but we don't know that. So to your point, Stuff Plus gives us a guide and something to see. And like you said, like he may pan out, he may not, but it is interesting to look at.
Yeah, and on day 3, like that's a really worthwhile chance. You're not making that decision with a $4 or $5 million choice, in the first round. Right. For instance, like let's compare Cam to like Brody Brecht, a right-handed pitcher out of Iowa. Brody Brecht has some really vicious stuff, and certainly he had more success than Ben Johnson. I'm not here to say that. Right. He can do things Ben Johnson can't do, and he can do things a lot of people can't do. But just in like an extreme example, Brody Brecht will throw some vicious stuff, but there are still questions about translatability at the pro level with some of his mechanics and some of his arsenals and whatever pitches.
Well, and I watched a lot of him, and as much as I'm a fan, he's from my hometown. Yeah. I've talked about that before. His stuff can be phenomenal, but like if he's not locating the fastball, nobody's going to fish for the slider. And even though he's throwing 101 miles an hour, if it's center cut middle, a guy's still going to catch it and hit it a long way. I mean, it's
I mean, that's an example where like the velocity certainly gives you a margin of error that other people are just not privy to. And like, again, I'm not here to knock Brody Brecht. He was kind of a first round caliber guy, and we'll see how that all turns out. But that's kind of when you take a guy that maybe like the R&D numbers are saying this guy should be really, really good or could be good, and then you have other kind of a disconnect maybe within the scouting realm or whatever. Day 1's a really difficult time to make that choice. Like Hurston Waldrop last year. I think and the last time I was on the pod, I kind of correlated that. Day 3 is a perfect day. I always say day 3 of the draft is for dreamers, so day 3 is for dreamers. And that's the thing where it's like you take a guy in the 16th round, You take a guy like Cooper, shorter left-hander, throws from a low slot, really good ride on the fastball. Probably only like 90, 91 in general. I think he can touch a little bit higher, to be honest. But it's not like a plus fastball with regard to velocity. But shoot, I don't know. I look at him and I just think, what if you do add a tick of velocity to that and he's able to continue locating the ball at the upper part of the zone like he has? You know, like day 3 is a perfect time for that, and you just hope you get a couple contributors out of that day.
Well, you know, that brings me to something else I noticed looking at the pitchers they did draft. I saw a lot of guys, obviously a lot of guys with good mix, multiple pitches, not a ton of high velo in this class. And that's something that for a long time the Cubs didn't have it in the system, and then they've been chasing it down, and it was interesting not to see it this year.
It's interesting. It's certainly interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it other than they might feel like their ability to get velocity out of pitchers is a little bit better than others, and so these are like undervalued guys. I am not sure. I am looking forward to digging into it with folks who are a little bit more connected later on. But like I kept seeing folks or people that they were taking that like they averaged about 90. And that's pretty low, right? Like it's Major League Baseball, like professional ball, like you need to in general be higher than that. And so there's part of it that I'm very curious about. I think that there's some element of it that could be as simple as biomechanically they think they can make an improvement to generate more velocity out of a guy without even having to do much of anything. And they targeted some small schools with regard to that. There's also some guys that while they didn't have a lot of velocity, they were tall pitchers. Like they were all tall. I think they took one guy that was less than 6'2". A lot of them were like 6'6". They were tall pitchers. And that feels like low-hanging fruit to get him into a pro development system. Add some more muscle, to the legs, the trunk, stuff like that, and just see if you can just get a tick or two of velocity. It would have been unheard of. Like if you transported me back to 2019, 2020, and you told me, yeah, the Cubs are, pretty widely known for like adding a tick or two of velocity to like all of their minor league arms, I would have kind of laughed because that was in an era when it was seen as revolutionary. At least I felt this way at the time, that we added a spike curve to Rowan Wick and all of a sudden got a 7th inning, 8th inning arm. Like that was like, oh man, we're cooking. The pitch lab is cooking. And now it's like we take a guy like Connor Noland who really bought into things on the minor league side, and he's like 90-94, which isn't, again, a ton of velocity, but that upper level is a lot higher than where he was. And so it just, I am very interested to dive into this class and talk with folks a little bit more because it's not a lot of velocity, so I'm curious what their development steps are.
Yeah, it's funny timing because this season we've seen Porter Hodge and Luke Little and Hunter Biggie come up and they're pumping gas, and we saw Caleb Killian pumping 99 in spring training before he got hurt. Merriweather's just back. I mean, Cubs finally have some gas in that pen. It's fun to watch.
Yeah, and I do think that there's some element of all this is that the guys that they tended to target in this class profile a little bit more as starting pitchers. And so
that's true.
What does it look like when they're in the pen? Well, I think that might look very different. And they may have some guys. I mean, Porter Hodge came out of high school. He was not pumping gas. But they just felt like they looked at where he was in his trajectory and the development steps, and now he is. And they're really vicious stuff. So really needed for this major league team. So, yep.
So how does this class start to slot in? Like, what guys do you think we could see making it into like your top 20 rankings or potentially even a top 100 list over the next like 2 years?
Cam Smith is a no doubt guy. I think I slot him in right around 6 to 8 in the system. I kind of go back and forth on that, and I have since the draft, but wouldn't possibly be further than 8th for me unless something really crazy kind of happens in affiliated ball or a massive swing issue. So I mean, he's about 6 to 8th for me. No doubt top 10 overall player in this class. Probably a little bit shy of a top 100 overall ranking with regard to prospects, but that could completely change like it did for Matt Shaw with him just going out and doing really well in affiliated ball.
And just for comparison's sake, I pulled up your what you have out there currently is your top 30, and that would put Cam Smith in the Kevin Alcantara, Jackson Wiggins range. For the listeners,
right about that. Yeah, I think he's better than Jackson Wiggins. I think right now, I might get some folks that get a little chippy with me on that.
Because there's such a huge difference between 8 and 9.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I think that they're all in the same tier for me. So it would be in the range of like Jefferson Rojas, Kevin Alcantara, Jackson Wiggins.
Okay.
3 really good players.
Oh yeah.
But players that, depending on how you internally view certain characteristics, you might prioritize a guy like Wiggins over them, or you might prioritize a guy like Cam Smith over like Jefferson Rojas. And a lot will be determined kind of in the next few weeks, but right in that tier of guys they're not top 100 guys, but you know what? If things don't have to go too far off for them to be in that top 100 overall.
Yeah. Who else would slot into maybe like your top 20?
Yeah, Cole Mathis, I think, is right about there. He would be somewhere in the top 20 for me, pretty clearly. I don't know exactly where he slots in, but he would be kind of right in that range. When we look at a few, it kind of gets more interesting after that. A guy like Ronnie Cruz, the Cubs clearly feel that they have a big investment in and a lot of trust in. I will likely hold off on that until I can see what he can do in Arizona.
That makes sense.
He's just so young. Like, he's so young that there's just so much development steps. Like, he's kind of like evaluating a high school junior. I don't know what he's going to look like next year. Now, he could come out absolutely smoking the ball and kind of a little bit force my hand as well. Like, it's not truly forcing my hand, but kind of make it seem like, all right, look at what he's doing to professional hitters or professional pitchers. But he's a guy that I'm not quite sure I'm going to rank yet. And then we get into some college guys that I'm really interested in, like Ivan Breathauer, a guy like Matt Hallback, who we didn't talk about, their 10th rounder out of San Diego and UCSD, I believe, and Eli Lovich is probably the other one that I would look at pretty closely. Lovich, they seem to really, really like a lot. I'm, again, probably he might not make my top 30, but somewhere right around there.
Yeah.
Ivan Breathauer and Matt Hallback, if they hit well in affiliated ball, I think are no doubts. I was big fans of those picks immediately when they happened, and so those would be the guys that I would watch for. Ty Southerson, if he hits well in affiliated ball next year, great. I love it, but otherwise, I'm just kind of cautiously optimistic there.
How similar do you think Breathauer's his name, right? Yeah. Is to like Jonathan Long that the Cubs took last year?
Yeah, pretty similar kind of a guy, actually. Pretty similar. Big barrel rates. I think that's actually a really, really good comp. And, with Johnny Long, the question is maybe more where does he slot in defensively? If you think he's a third baseman, I don't think there's much of a question he would be over Breathauer. But I was a big Johnny Long fan of the draft last year. I still am. And I think that's the kind of player and profile that you kind of need to see from a hitting side with a guy like Ivan Breathauer. I mean, they're different players. Breathauer is going to be much more driven to launch. But that type of affiliated success is what you're going to need to see from those guys. And that's what I'm kind of waiting for on that one, certainly. I think that's a really, really good comparison there to Johnny Long. I think it's a really good one. He and Brian Comer are kind of very similar from that regard, but Long's having more success.
Do you get much from the people you talk to about when you're prepping for the draft and stuff? Like the Cubs system now, a few years ago, everybody was in A-ball, and now they're kind of loaded at AAA, it seems like, and they're log jams at certain positions. We're talking about the deadline, and if the Cubs were having a better season, this might be a year where they give up one or two of their top prospects and maybe go get a closer or something. But at this point, I think it's pretty obvious, unless there's a bigger piece that helps beyond this season, they're probably not going to add a ton. Um, when do you think the Cubs are going to start working the kids into the actual plan? Like we saw, I've said on my podcast several times, I think they wasted a bunch of opportunities to find out who Matt Mervis was, wasting time on other players. And Alexander Canario's got 43 Major League plate appearances despite the amount of time he spent on the big league roster. I mean, it's interesting that they talk about the farm all the time, but it seems like they don't prioritize getting those guys up.
What? Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll push back a little bit on that. I think the Matt Mervis thing is pretty worthy of a reflection. I think it is. I think that they probably could have brought him up in September of 2022, given him a real opportunity just to get the jitters out.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. Get used to the coaching staff, get the jitters out, just kind of get used to it. There was nothing there was no risk to letting him play at the end of the year other than occupying a 40-man spot. And that's not... The Cubs seem to prioritize those. And so, whatever, that's fine. But, that was probably a missed opportunity. Alexander Canario, love Canario, really like Alexander, I think he's a great dude. He is still showing a lot of swing and miss, even at AAA. Like, he's productive, but he's showing a lot of swing and miss.
Okay.
And so I think he still demonstrates that teams don't, at least the Cubs don't seem to really trust that that's going to work long-term, per se. Now, in a completely lost season, I agree. I think that you would bring him up. If this is 2022, we would be seeing Alexander Canario probably slotting in a DH almost every day.
Yeah.
With them kind of still having a chance, it's a little bit
That's
harder. True. It might be different in August. That being said, where we talk about, in general, working the kids in, I think we got to look at the top of the system. Moises Ballesteros, what he is doing is straight up historic. It's not even just historic for the Cubs. It is in the upper echelon of incredible stuff that players have done at age 20 in AA and AAA. I don't know where he slots in defensively long term. He's getting to a point where I almost don't care. But I think he still deserves a chance to catcher, and I'm more just being glib. He may truly command major league time this year. And I think that there is something to be said for sometime in late August or whatever, giving him a real chance at the major league level. Letting him kind of get used to it. I don't even care if he catches. You could have him, if you still believe he can be a catcher long-term, you can still have him in the catching meetings and getting kind of that process underway, catching pen sessions, etc., and then just focusing on hitting. I think we are coming to a time that Moises Ballesteros could potentially just force his way up to Chicago, and it's not that far off.
And he's 20.
Yeah, he's just 20. I mean, it really is quite crazy what he's doing. Matt Shaw might get up there. I mean, I think that he probably is in AAA pretty soon. He may just force his way up to the major leagues as well. I get questions on Owen Casey as well. He still has some work to do, but I think he's getting closer. And then he was kind of banged up.
Progress.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think he's doing exactly what you want. But I did have some folks that are like, what are they going to do with Ian Happ? They got to try to convince him to waive his no-trade clause. I don't think that happens. And
I don't either.
I mean, there's a reason that he got a no-trade clause, because he didn't want to leave, or certainly have the option. It'd be one thing, and I don't believe that this is going to happen in the slightest. It would be one thing if the executive leadership of the Cubs came to some of these guys and said, it's over. We are tearing it down to the studs. We're going to be picking 3rd next year and then 10th the following year because of the lottery rules. We are done. That would be different, but that's not the intention, and I think that's not the issue. So Owen Casey, when he forces his way up, he forces his way up. But I think Moises Ballesteros and Matt Shaw might get to that point here very soon, potentially this season. A guy like James Triantos probably needs to be in AAA here for his development.
Yeah.
It depends on what they do with Matt Shaw, which sucks. And, I think they should both kind of split time a little bit differently, but whatever. But James Triantos probably needs to be up in at least AAA here fairly soon. there are some teams that would likely have him close to the majors like right now. So I think this is the time to start getting the kids involved. And even PCA, despite not hitting, has actually gotten a lot of plate appearances. And it's still kind of looking a little rough. But he's getting some playing time. And I think that kind of shows what the Cubs do with the top of the system. Good or bad. I'm not arguing that necessarily, but good or bad, I think the top of the system, they are going to find playing time for those guys or move them, which is a very real possibility. And, not for rentals, thank goodness, but other than that, either at this deadline or in the winter, it is time to make some movement, if for nothing else, to allow those players to have a better chance of their career.
Yeah, and it thins out the system and gives, it's getting hard now to bring guys up from AA to AAA because the guys at AAA are playing well and not going anywhere. And
absolutely.
That's one of my bigger, obviously I want the Cubs to win everything, so that's my number one disappointment. But my number two disappointment is that here at the deadline, we're maybe not going to be making one of those big trades where the Cubs are in a position now with outfielders and first base, third baseman. They've got some depth in the system and pitching. They've got some depth they can trade from and not really set themselves back and help the big league team. And it's going to wind up being a missed opportunity this year.
I think so. I think it's very likely that it's a missed opportunity. I like at least some of the messaging. I mean, I know folks, Jed's position is going to be a bit of a lightning rod right now. It just is. But for as challenging sometimes as the Cubs messaging has been from the executive leadership team, I felt like the messaging that Jed had yesterday or whatever was very sound.
Yes,
it was basically,
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, we aren't ruling anything out. A lot can change. We're not prioritizing rentals. I mean, everybody kept saying, I'm not going to call out specific writers, but there was immediate declarations of the Cubs have announced they're selling. Well, that's not what he said at all. I mean, that might be the vibe, but it is not what he said. And the quote is out there. The whole video quote is out there. People should listen to it. He didn't say they were selling. Yes. He said they're not focused on rentals primarily, or only. And he said those weren't the only moves they were going to make. It is kind of funny that they could actually still trade, probably not a big thing, but a rental. Maybe there's just a pen arm that doesn't happen to be very expensive, and their R&D guys are like, this guy's good. You know what? Let's just do this. It is very low cost. But I do like the messaging about that they're still looking for guys that are going to help in 2025 and beyond. Mm-hmm. And while those deals are a lot harder to execute, it's not impossible. Mm-hmm. And if something gets crazy, you really want to have some groundwork laid out there that, you know what, Vlad Guerrero is a name that gets tossed around a lot. Vlad Guerrero Jr., obviously. Vlad Guerrero might honestly help the Cubs lineup at times too, but Vlad Guerrero Jr. is kind of the poster child for what that looks like, at least. Whether he is moved at all, he is a guy where if you get him, I mean, yes, I would love it if they won, but I don't really care what happens for the rest of 2024. Because the whole point of getting him now is you view he's going to get moved. We won't have another chance at him, so we just do it now. Because otherwise we would try in the winter, but that's not going to be an option, so we just do it now. If Kyle Tucker was on the market, he's not going to be. But if he was on the market from the Astros, you just do it now. I don't care if they lose 50 straight games to end the season. It means nothing to me because the only thing that matters is you have Kyle Tucker for 2025. And I think that messaging is still good that they are prioritizing that. I don't know what that'll ultimately end up looking like. I think it's going to be a little bit of a light sell with still the hope to kind of buy long term if those deals even happen.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild deadline with so many teams in it, but not all the way in it, and not really probably wanting to sell to, this is, I think, a year a lot of teams stand pat. But Greg, thanks for coming on today. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time, but this was great. And maybe over the off season, maybe we'll talk again and talk about some trade options. I think it could be a really interesting trade season in the off season.
I think it could be a very interesting and hey, I always appreciate coming on here. I really like the pod. I like the vibe of it, and anytime.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller. I was joined by Greg Zumach today. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!